Welcome back to the Free Spirits Podcast. I'm Lars Miller, joined as always by my co-host David Gonzalez. Before we dive in, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really does help the podcast grow and reach more listeners passionate about the cannabis and hemp industries. Today we are thrilled to welcome Joanne Caceres, a partner at Dentons in Chicago, one of the nation's most experienced cannabis law experts. Joanne advises clients across the U.S. on navigating complex cannabis regulations and has been deeply involved in drafting cannabis legislation. Joanne, great to have you with us.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. So you've been on the front lines of cannabis policy development for years. What are some key trends or shifts in the cannabis regulation that you're noticing today?
The biggest thing right now is hemp, obviously. Right? There hasn't been as much progress in cannabis or as fast progress as cannabis. And I think we're, as an industry, we've come to terms with that it's just going to be a lot slower than anyone anticipated or wanted, right? So people are focusing on state level improvements when it comes to cannabis. And then the same thing is sort of happening on the hemp side too, right? We didn't get the Farm Bill last year, which, in case there's any listeners who don't know, the 2018 Farm Bill is what legalized hemp in the first place and created what people often call the hemp loophole, which allowed for these intoxicating products. A lot of folks thought that the next Farm Bill would address that, potentially closing the loophole or potentially adding regulations. That remains to be seen, but I mean, if any of you have been following the news, it kind of seems like the Farm Bill might not happen this year either, right? So yeah, I don't think there's a solution coming from the federal government. And so the reaction has been pretty much the same, right? People are focusing on state level reform, state level advocacy. And there's maybe more of an openness for the two sides to work together as opposed to enemies now. I think there's a bit of a, if you can't beat them, join them mentality. Before it was kind of like we have to snuff this industry out. And I was one of the odd birds saying, do you really snuff them out? Shouldn't you guys team up? And, I mean, it was just inevitable because cannabis has been so slow and hemp has become such a great market opportunity that would ultimately happen. And the one other thing that I'm sure you guys are aware of is the explosion of hemp beverages, right? Not only are they doing great and there's hundreds of products and Minnesota's kind of the shining beacon of what that industry might look like. They're really well organized and they've made friends with the alcohol folks and the alcohol lobbies who know how to do this a lot better than we do and have a lot more money to do it too, right? And also more potentially some of the folks that might have been against it before. So we are seeing a lot of movement there. A lot of states, even if they are prohibiting certain intoxicating hemp products, have considered carve-outs either for low-dose, all types of edibles, or just beverages. Just beverages, 21 plus, in liquor stores, sometimes even only. But it seems like we're finally getting to that world that I think some of us imagined 5 years ago, which was that we would kind of get this low-dose, kind of curious hemp product that would exist, and that would be sold through all the normal channels you usually get your alcohol at, and then you would potentially still have dispensaries that are specialized that are focusing on flower and vapes, which is, even to this day, most of what they sell anyway, even if they have other product formats. So it all just needs to make sense like that.
So Joanne, looking across the country, we see obviously a federal legislation, we have state-by-state legislation, we have a hemp market, we have an alcohol market, we have a cannabis market, all these things going on. And it can be like playing whack-a-mole, trying to figure out, okay, which state is doing what today. You almost need your own law degree just to participate in this industry. But I'm curious what it's like for you, and what is it actually like to go in and craft legislation? I know you're a big part of rescheduling and drafting some of that legislation. What is that process actually like? Like, how does the sausage get made? How do people actually come up with these rules, legislation? Like, how does this happen? Can you walk us through the process?
So one thing I usually love to joke about is that there's no concept of plagiarism in lawyering, right? Lawyering is all about using precedents, right? Especially if they're good ones, right? Or learning from bad ones and using them. And there's no, like, I wrote this law, that means every single word in this bill is something I wrote. It's always building on something else, right? So when I do policy work, a lot of it comes down to just what has been my experience in the industry, what states have my clients complained about, what really hurts them, what has worked really well, what hasn't. And you kind of start just developing the sense of that. So a lot of times if I'm advising like the Department of Health in a new state, or even if I'm advising on the federal level, I'll remember things like, oh, Colorado has really good vape safety regulations. They were the first state to kind of put that in, right? So if I want to put in vape safety safety regulations, I'm going to look at that as a precedent and I'm going to kind of build off of it. So there's a lot of that. And there's a lot of like, if you look at, the unlimited license states versus the limited license states in cannabis, whether they were one or the other really shaped the way those markets developed. Right. So depending on which one you think is doing better, you might want to veer towards laws that are more similar to one or the other. And then for sure, I have like an Illinois bias, but I do think Illinois was a great sample state because it was really it wasn't one of the first states, but it was one of the first non-Western states. And when it was drafted, first of all, my colleague, Eric Berlin, who's the head of our group, was a major player in drafting that. And when he was working on it, it was like the only way that medical cannabis was going to pass in Illinois was if we could say, this is going to be a strict, tight law. It's not going to be like the Western states where, you've got like the Canna doctors with their bulletin boards, right? And in Venice Beach or whatever. I don't know if you've been there, but like that, they were like, it's not going to be that. It's going to be really tightly regulated. It's going to be really secure. It's going to prevent diversion, basically all the things that were the Cole memo priorities. And it was the first state to really have like a big social equity component in its bill. Mm-hmm. It was right at that time in like 2019. So for a long time, I was also like, Illinois is great and I like the way it works. And also I understand it very well because literally the partner I work with wrote it. So I would often take a lot of like the things I like from Illinois first, and then I would build off of that. And then on the federal level, like I said, even though there hasn't been any movement, there's been a lot proposed in the past, right? So there was the MORE Act, which we also looked at and advised on a little bit. There's like the PREPARE Act. There was the Regulate Marijuana, like Alcohol Act, right? So there's been a lot of ones before. So just looking at those, and that's not going to work. A lot of it you can see is like it's from alcohol, and not all of it translates 100%. So just based on my personal experience working with cannabis and hemp clients day in and day out, it's like, this isn't how the industry works, or this doesn't make sense for us, or this is going to be impossible to enforce, and just kind of tinkering with it that way and educating the legislators about why we think it should be that way.
So I like one of the points that you made there. It sounds like your own approach to helping on a state level, at least, is to take an iterative approach. Mm-hmm. What worked in this market? Can we apply it to this one? I think one of the things that we've noticed covering the hemp industry that's been, I'll call it frustrating being an operator in it, is it's kind of a forward and backwards. What I mean by that is you have some states that do exactly what you are saying. They look at a model that's working and thinking, how can I improve that, do better, and adopt that? Whereas you have others that look at that model and say, I'm going to close my eyes and come up with something completely different that doesn't make any fundamental sense at all. Can you walk me through, like, I guess, why that might happen? Is there interest from other parties who look at this industry and think that it's either safety, it's a capital risk? Why is there such this discrepancy from a state-by-state level on which rules they choose to adopt if there are models that we can see out there that do?
Yeah, I mean, a big part of it's just going to be like, who are the stakeholders that have people's attention, right? And who donated to your campaign, right? So you can kind of see when it can only be sold in liquor stores, you have to assume that it's, the liquor lobby is going hard in that state, right? But yeah, I mean, it's similar to cannabis too, and you see it in cannabis laws. I mean, now that they're all older, maybe they've kind of evened out a little bit, right? They've modulated a little bit towards each other. But like what I was saying for Illinois, like that had a lot of like public safety. There were a lot of like strong public safety proponents working on that bill. So they had a lot of that. Or Ohio's another great example where they knew that they needed to pass a law, but they didn't actually really want to. So they were purposely drafting it to make it very difficult. They were going to require like a pharmacist in every dispensary, right? And a lot of like the advocacy from the industry is like, here's why that will literally destroy this industry, right? So I wish it were like more logical than just who's got the lawmakers' attention, but it pretty much is who has the lawmakers' attention and who's donated most recently, probably. And some people are, just humility, right? Some people just think they're going to do it better, even if there's good examples that they should be looking at.
So, and again, this isn't legal advice for anybody. But would your advice be for people who are on the ground, boots on the ground, who are lobbying at Capitol Hill, et cetera? One of the things you highlighted in there, especially in Illinois, was the emphasis on public safety. Do you think that should be kind of the first principle or place that all these different states should start from and then build legislation on top of that? Like, does that just have to be table stakes, start from safety first and then build your legislation? Is that kind of the best way to think about this?
For hemp, I kind of think, safety is always going to be something that's going to resonate with people, right? Even if you don't know much about hemp or if you're scared about the product, you're pro safety, right? You're not going to meet someone who says they're anti safety, right? But I think when it comes to hemp regulation, what I like to say is the product's already out there. It's already being sold. And you're not going to stop that right now, right? It's like there's too many of them. And there are responsible actors in this industry that want to be regulated. They want the certainty of knowing what they're required to do. And they want to be able to show investors that, they're a cut above the rest because they're able to do these things. So we often come with that tack. Like, we want to be regulated. And then I also like to, sometimes I'll compare it to the trajectory of marijuana. And you'll say, look, these states have done it right and the sky didn't fall and teen rates haven't gone up and all that good jazz. And then you're like, and do you really want your 16-year-old kid ordering hemp THC drinks on the internet and getting it delivered to their door? Because that's what's happening right now. So instead of that, how about we do some responsible regulation and coming as the industry and saying, we want to be regulated. We want sensible regulations, let's say, right? Because you don't want to get cannabis level regs on hemp.
Right.
What you want is cannabis regs to come down to something reasonable, like what the hemp regs are mostly coming out to right now, right? But I think that has a lot of traction now, this idea of like adults should be able to choose what they do. They can do it responsibly, and we just need safeguards in place to keep it out of the hands of children and to make sure that they're not, laced with poison. We had the only negative stories I've really heard. There was the E-Valley crisis back in the day. That was mostly non-cannabis vapes, but even I think the few cannabis vapes that were implicated had evidence of being refilled. So they weren't state regulated vapes, right? Which ended up kind of being a great story. Like, the regulated market did not cause this problem. So same thing with hemp that I've seen. I saw this article about 3 individuals dying from Delta 8 vapes, right? And I was like, okay, that's interesting. Let me look at it. And when you look at it, it was the same brand and they were laced with rat poison. So it's like, okay, so the rat poison killed people. But so, yeah, I don't want someone making a Delta 8 vape with rat poison. But if you have no regulations, you're going to get all the way from the super responsible actors that we all know and love that are doing like organic GMP certified products. And you're going to get the dude who put rat poison either on purpose or by mistake. So it should be an easy argument when you look at it that way.
Yeah. Switching gears a bit, you talked about safety, talked about responsible actors in the industry. Speaking solely to the hemp industry and what Texas has passed, basically doing a complete ban in their state, the bad actors are going to keep selling. So in reality, the legislation is saying, oh, we're trying to be safe and keep our people safe. But by banning it, you're actually making it more unsafe because all the good actors that you were speaking to who want to be regulated and have a seat at the table are going to pull out of the state completely because they have to, and the bad actors are going to stay. What would you say to those legislators in terms of safety and that?
Right. I mean, it just goes right back to what I was just saying, right? You don't have people dying from rat poison in milk, right? Because it's regulated, right? And there's rules around it and there's enforcement. So but you do still have a lot of folks who still kind of have that devil's lettuce mentality, even with hemp or cannabis, and think that it's dangerous or that it's just a moral bad. Which I mean, that just takes education, right? There's still folks like that. I think they can be swayed if they hear some personal stories and stuff. That's always kind of been the bedrock of the advocacy and the movement is know someone who's benefited from it, meet someone who's more normal that uses it responsibly, right? And realize it's not this big scary thing. But yeah, exactly what you said is, what I would tell any state that's trying to prohibit it. You're just going to eliminate the good actors who aren't going to go into your state if you say it's not allowed. You're going to keep all these DTC sellers that even if you ramped up your enforcement dollars and you went after them to shut them down, like they'll just shut down that website and they'll open a new website because it's still too profitable. And it'll continue to be profitable because there's not a legal channel to get it in your state. So, it's just a war on drugs all over again. I think we generally agree that the war on drugs did not work. So why would you repeat it?
I wanted to go back to day one of the Farm Bill dropping, 2018 version. What was that like for you as a law firm? Like, did somebody, who was the first person or company to approach you and say, "Hey, did you see that 2018 bill about farming? What do you think about us launching a THC product?" Were you looking at them like they had five heads? Like, what was that period of time like, or was it much more professional than I'm giving it credit towards?
No, it was I don't know that many people saw that as the opportunity with the Farm Bill at that time. So first of all, just another level set, there was the 2014 Farm Bill, which allowed for hemp pilot programs. So there was already like a lot of CBD products, CBD drinks, and everyone kind of thought that's what it was going to continue being. And it was for a while. For a while, there was kind of like that huge CBD boom. It was wild. To answer your question too, like the law changed. Just everyone wanted to know what it meant. What could they do? What could they not do? And every single state, I want to say almost, maybe it was like 47 states. I think Idaho was a little late, but every single state in that next legislative session was doing their state plans. And every state was doing it slightly different. And as you mentioned, like everyone in the industry has to be a lawyer. As a lawyer, even for me, I was like, how do we even possibly keep up with how fast these things are changing and how different it is in different states? And people want to, like, how do we comply with all the states? And we'd be like, you can't, it's impossible, right? And hemp THC kind of feels that way too. But I think back then it really did still feel like people thought it was a CBD play. Maybe you would get some full spectrum products that like could maybe give you some sensation, but nobody was thinking, I'm going to make a 5 milligram drink and it's just going to be a straight up substitute for cannabis. Like that started happening a little bit more like after the pandemic, really. Maybe I missed some of it in the pandemic because I was inside all the time.
Sure.
But I feel like the first hemp THC beverages I really kind of saw on the market was like, Wink was doing Delta 8 beverages and they were doing Delta 9 inside the cannabis regulated channels. And the bending over backwards crazy things they had to do to try to develop drinks state by state.
Oh, yeah.
I think it just became inevitable to them. They're like, it doesn't make sense to do it this way.
Yeah, it was pretty funny. We had Angus on the podcast at one point, and we were like, oh, it literally took a Tesla engineer to figure out how to actually make these products compliantly in different states. But you bring up a good point, which was you go back to the origins of, I guess, this boom of new types of products coming out. You had 2014, which gave rise to that CBD wave. I guess 2018 was more of a resurgence of that CBD wave. And then you could argue 2022, Minnesota's legislation kind of set the tone for this next kind of inflection point that we're on. And so I wanted to ask you as well, what are these conversations like now? Because it seems like back then it was, can we do this? The answer was kind of yes, kind of no. But now it's not can we or can't we? It's more of like, how far can we push this gray area? Can I add nootropics? Can I add functional ingredients? Can I add mushrooms into my drinks? What does that look like? Or how has that kind of evolution of what a hemp product is really changed over the past few years for you guys? And what kind of questions are you getting asked on how far can you stretch what actually is a compliant hemp product?
It's a really interesting question, right? Because it's also like a very cool case study about, like, if you think about cannabis as state regulated but federally illegal and hemp as federally legal, you see so much more innovation on the federally legal side. And that's not an accident. I think that's because they kind of have more time and opportunity to do so, right? But yeah, I think it's a little bit of that, and it is just a little bit of all these other trends we're seeing in beverages generally, right? Like people are drinking less generally. People are really into functional drinks generally. Like I remember nootropics seemed super new and like edgy during the pandemic, and I'm pretty sure I went down some nootropic rabbit holes myself, right? Because everyone was just bored and biohacking at home. But it's like all of those things kind of are converging together to create this really interesting moment in hemp products. And then I do think that there are some, at least amongst the type of hemp businesses that I am associated with, there is kind of a unified vision now of where we should ultimately be going, right? I think people that are concerned with safety kind of see and understand this idea that we don't actually know as much about the safety of synthetic and all these new chemicals. My favorite one, THC-JD, the THC for lawyers. It's 13 times more potent than THC, right? But these compounds, they're similar, but they're not your grandfather's weed, right? It's almost like the what the anti folks say, where they're always like, the potency is so much higher. You're like, but it's still the same. It's the same thing. Like, it's been used for millennia. I think we can all feel generally kind of comfortable that it probably is pretty safe.
Right.
And of course, there's still work to be done on that. But like with the newer ones, it's like those are kind of all bets off. Those are new. Like, we're kind of down with the FDA's position that we need to know more about those. So I think there's consensus around that, like that synthetics ought to go away or be more regulated or go through more testing. Mm-hmm. And then I think there's also consensus on, hey, if it's intoxicating and it's meant to be marketed that way, then it should be limited to adults.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So one of the things that caught my attention was it looks like a handful of product or companies that you work with are using, instead of necessarily like nootropics or other synthetics, they're really leaning into more of these minor cannabinoids, leading into that entourage effect that we discussed earlier. But it is still such a strange environment. And I'm happy you brought up the FDA. I was telling Lars, I had a story the other day where, so my business partner has a manufacturing facility and he's telling me I had the FDA come visit. And the entire time the FDA is obviously auditing this entire space, making sure everything's fine and good. And then they don't really say a word, but they leave a paper that says more or less like, the FDA does not approve of this, but oh, by the way, you can continue to do it without any consequences. And it was kind of like this weird middle ground. You're like, okay, you're watching me do this and you're telling me you don't condone it, but nothing's going to happen. And so I guess one of the questions I had for you is, who should ultimately regulate this stuff at the end of the day? Is this an FDA thing? Is it a TTB thing? Who are the most qualified and who has the most resources to actually regulate this burgeoning industry and to do it right?
Well, you talk to 8 people, you'll get 8 different opinions. I'm personally a fan of TTB, or I've been convinced by others to be a fan of TTB. Generally, the alcohol industry thinks that they're kind of good partners, that they're smart and savvy. They've come to understand the product, and they're willing to work with the industry. The alcohol industry, of course, has done a lot of good self-regulating steps too, right? Like they have their own advertising council. I forget what it's called, but they like police themselves and all this jazz, right? So a lot of people like that model, think it's worked well, think there's similarities, right, in terms of it being like an intoxicating product. So that seems to be a good fit. And at the same time, the TTB does have like memorandums of understanding with the FDA, right? Like the TTB isn't the one that's going in to do inspections. It's still FDA that does that, right? So one thing that we have definitely proposed before for federal legislation is this model of TTB handles it, but they have MOUs with USDA and FDA, right, for that subject matter expertise. Another one that I really like and I think would also make sense would be maybe it's housed in the TTB, but it's an Office of Cannabis Management, right? Because there's a reason that states have ended up mostly, I mean, Illinois is one of the examples that sort of has a cannabis head, but is still kind of split between IDPH and IDFPR and DOA. But it's such a unique product. Like it's used in so many different formats. It's used for so many different reasons. There's obviously still a very strong medical case for it. And, we can talk about rescheduling. Like maybe that will eventually go into a rescheduling channel. But it's not one-to-one to alcohol. It's not one-to-one to food and bev. It's not one-to-one to tobacco. It's not one-to-one to pharmaceuticals. It's its own thing that sort of has a little bit of all of that. Right. So it kind of makes sense for there to be like a cannabis agency who focuses on that and then digs into the other agencies as they need.
Sure. I like that answer.
So you mentioned the TTB and alcohol being a good model, so to speak. We were recently speaking with a founder who launched a not beer product that is infused with THC. So, because you're not allowed to produce beer and infuse it, is this something you see evolving over time, being allowed to infuse beer, obviously non-alcoholic, or is that something that we're not going to see much of anytime soon, besides the products that are not beer?
I think you'll get the not beer. You're probably never going to get beer because you don't get beer with caffeine and you don't get beer with melatonin. It's just generally like, right? Like beer kind of like alcohol stands alone. Like if you read the Controlled Substances Act and it defines what a controlled substance is and you read that definition, you're like, okay, alcohol totally fits into this. But then it says, except it doesn't mean tobacco or alcohol, right? Like we just took them out, right? And so like that, like I said, that sort of makes sense for cannabis, but it also sort of doesn't because cannabis is medicine and cannabis is health and functional. Like it's not just intoxicating, right? And
Mm-hmm.
that's something I actually still grapple with now. Sometimes even with my clients that are working in cannabis, like they'll say something to me and I'm like, well, that's kind of looking at cannabis as if it's just a vice, and it's not, right? Like it's
Mm-hmm.
not just a vice. So they're like, we don't want to promote smoking, and I was like, well, why not? It can be a really effective method for medical use, like. So there is sometimes a little bit, even people that are pro cannabis or working in cannabis, it's hard to get rid of that stigma, even yourself, even if you think you're a proponent of the industry. And sometimes your thought process is affected by it in ways you don't realize unless someone kind of points it out.
Yeah. So, from your vantage point, when you're advising your clients, what's one of the biggest licensing challenges that surprises different beverage founders when they start out in the space?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing is, what do you mean there's 50 different state laws that I have to comply with if I want to sell, right? That's not the way most products work. I keep saying milk, but like if you make some other consumer product, there's one set of rules you follow generally, right?
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol is a little more similar, right? Where there's some stuff that's regulated on the federal level, but there is a lot of state control. The state control is usually more in like the how you sell it, when you sell it, what days you're allowed to sell it, right? And then the federal law is like how it's labeled, how you make sure it's safe, and how you get licensed, right? So you can see that model working here too. But so I cannot tell you, like I've diligenced companies that are like very well known CBD companies, right? Like great reputations. They're doing amazing. Like I said before, they're all CGMP and they're doing all these amazing stuff. And then I'm like, all right, cool. Well, can you also send me your licenses so that you like your state licenses to sell your products retail? And like the times I've just gotten blank stares back, like I'm the first person to ever tell them that some states require you to be licensed.
Mm-hmm.
This is your business. How do you not know that? But it is, like you guys said, it's so much to keep up with it, even for me, and it's literally my job to do that, right? So I think that's the biggest thing that people are surprised about.
Yeah, and obviously you mentioned 50 state laws as well as some federal, but are there any states, you mentioned Minnesota earlier, but is there any state that you would highlight that have rolled these regulations out particularly well or particularly poorly? Besides Texas.
Yeah, I think most people would agree that Minnesota's done a good job. I haven't been up there personally, but I've also heard just great things about being there, right? Like you can just go into a lunch place and you can order a can of a hemp beverage the same way you would order a beer, and it's kind of like the future. Welcome to the future. I think we look at like states like California, and I understand what they're doing right now, of course, but like California and New York, like they both have such weird, strict 15-to-1 CBD ratio and this and that, and it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, like when it gets so weird and strict that it's effectively a prohibition against anyone who's actually going to follow that rule, because it makes it prohibitively expensive and also like not make sense as a commercial product. Like, so when I think about like tough hemp states, even though they have some pro-hemp laws, I often think of California and New York as being just needlessly complicated. Of course, California's just not allowing it at all right now anymore, but before. And then, I mean, there's just a lot of states that all it says is it just has the definition of industrial hemp. Illinois is a good example of that. It just has that definition and nothing else. So people are just having to make things up on their own, which really doesn't benefit anyone, right? The people that want to do it right are disadvantaged because they're spending more, and the people that don't want to do it right, they can say, where does it say I have to do anything more, So that's been the big issue. Like it's always one or the other. Like it's barely like you have just right regulations.
And I'm laughing a bit because I've been that person who was like, wait, what do you mean I need a license in all these different states, and like how quickly that cost adds up. One of the other things that I wanted to discuss as well as you highlighted earlier a couple times, and I guess it's one of the big differentiators between these adult use markets and these hemp markets, and it is this D2C channel. And one could argue that that's an advantage that hemp operators have over adult use markets, being able to sell your products across state lines. I know you do a lot of work on risk management as well, and so I guess my question for you would be, what should the future of D2C for hemp products look like? And maybe what would your preferred version look like versus what do you think will actually shake out? There's a lot of rumbling on Capitol Hill that that's something that legislators are gunning for. I guess in your perfect world, how would it look? And then in contrast, what do you think reality will really look like for D2C for hemp moving forward?
In a perfect world, for intoxicating hemp, it's just the alcohol model, right? Alcohol. You can buy alcohol D2C too. Folks don't do it much because it's very expensive, and you have, the liquor store down the street. Some sort of, ideally, what you would have is either technology on the front end that confirms the person is 21, and then also confirming at delivery, but at the very least confirming at delivery that you're handing it to a 21-year-old, right? Maybe you're not so strict that it has to be the name of the person you're delivering to or anything like that, but
right.
The issue with both of those things is that they're prohibitively expensive, is what my clients tell me. And it is kind of easy to be the lawyer and be like, oh, just do this. And then they're like, well, we looked at it and it costs $1 per order, and that's prohibitively expensive, right? But so, hopefully, there definitely is talk about DTC being one of those bargaining chips that might go away. But also a lot of the big players have been very successful in D2C. So I don't think anyone wants to see it go away.
Right.
And folks like convenience, right? It just comes back down to that. Like, I'm a cannabis attorney, and I rarely go into a dispensary. I don't want to drive to a different place, show my ID, have to pay cash, all that jazz for like 1 or 2 products, but I can click online very easily and accept it at my door very easily, even if I have to be there to sign, right?
Absolutely.
And you also hear about other professionals who aren't in the cannabis industry that don't want to be seen at a dispensary, right? Like, they're pillars of their community, and they don't want to run into like their patients or like be a judge and run into someone at these facilities. So
yeah, we Lars and I get the fun job of seeing all the tribal fighting on LinkedIn, and that happens all the time between obviously the adult use market and the hemp market. But one of the points that always gets brought up is right now it's not federally legal. There are all these states that have zero access. Your only option is black market product, and it by definition will not be safe. And I guess, rounding this out, and my last question for you is, one of the big reasons why there is so much infighting is because it seems like, for one party, these are unfair rules or advantages. For others, it's an old way of doing things. It's the way of the past. And really what they're both trying to say is, what would cannabis use look like if it were federally legal? So my last question for you is, what would the actual immediate impacts, what would those immediate impacts be if cannabis got rescheduled tomorrow? If this was all nationally, federally legal, how do these markets then shake out? Do they converge? Do they still stay separate? How would that look? Because you've gotten the chance to actually write this legislation or propose it, what might that actually look like on a national level?
Yeah, I think there's like a long-term answer that's more like what you're going for. Short-term, it's going to look like just total chaos because no one's going to know what it means or what to do. It'll be like what I was saying for 2018 Farm Bill. Like, every state's going to have to go into session and figure out, what does this mean for our program? Are we going to adjust our program to try to make it comply and become part of Schedule 3, or are we going to still be comfortable having this parallel system that doesn't totally line up with the federal law? And also, is the federal government going to be cool with those systems still existing in this parallel mentality when we have rescheduling, right? So there are some people who say rescheduling is going to be so amazing, and they are thinking about it as it becoming effectively legal and becoming more like the hemp industry. That's probably not going to happen overnight, and rescheduling doesn't make the state programs legal. And then there's also the fearful people that are like, as soon as this gets rescheduled, the FDA stops just leaving that little letter, right? The FDA starts saying, now you're in my turf, and I have authority to regulate you, and I'm going to make you do all this other stuff. And we're going to say, but we already do all this other stuff, and it's really expensive. And they're going to say, we don't care. You have to do our stuff too, right? So there's kind of the both sides, and probably both are a little bit right, and it's just going to be complete chaos. But long term, ideally, what we would want to see, I think you're right, it would basically be, I think I sort of talked about this earlier, like, there's always going to be that, like, a cannabis user who uses a lot, who's going to probably veer towards flower and vape products, both for value and for benefit and use for the way they're going to use it. And then there's going to be this potentially bigger but less lucrative market of the canna curious folks, like the people who maybe just want a 5 milligram gummy, like when they go to a concert, right? But they're not using it like every day. They're going to want to buy it at the same place they buy their alcohol, or the same place where they buy their groceries, or they're going to want to buy it online. They're not going to go to a dispensary. So yeah, I do always imagine a future that's kind of like alcohol. Like, you can buy it online. I could see it being more successful online versus alcohol, just because beverages are heavy to ship. Yeah. And then you might still have, you might still have dispensaries that are, I would assume, focused more on vapes and flowers, although they could have other products too. And then you would have the same brands making low dose products that would be sold through more traditional channels.
I do have actually one follow-up question before we wrap here. So I also noticed you do some work in psychedelics. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, we talked about alcohol and cannabis being lumped together. Do you see a world where there's essentially, you said they're not necessarily vices, but do you see a world where there's like a vice mart, a cornucopia of all these different types of intoxicating or mind-altering products that are all sold under one roof? Or is that a pipe dream?
You could see it. I mean, it's funny. A lot of times when I think about like psilocybin and DMT and stuff, it still feels like that's going to be mostly medical when you talk about legalization. But then I have to remind myself that if I were doing medical cannabis in '96, I would probably say the same thing, right? So it's kind of like a never say never. You haven't seen the markets, you haven't seen these like mushroom markets kind of grow as quickly as cannabis markets have, and you haven't seen that kind of like business hunger to figure it out and do it yet, but it might just be because we're in the early days. Right. Sure. Well, we're still seeing a lot of our clients are still like life sciences and they're going after like a pharma product. They're not like, I mean, I know I have one client who wants to make mushroom gummies and it's like, well, good luck. I don't know exactly where you're going to do that yet, but probably in like 10 to 15 years, you'll be able to buy low dose mushroom gummies legally in some state. It might not be federally legal, right? But just follow the same trajectory.
So Joanne, thank you so much for your invaluable insights with us today. For our listeners who want to follow your work or support your advocacy efforts, where can they connect with you?
LinkedIn is the best place to connect with me. I'm actually I'm like just enough of a millennial where I never joined TikTok and do not intend to. Only have a personal Instagram that is not used for work. LinkedIn, you can connect with me on LinkedIn. I post there a lot, especially if I see like every now and then I'll get like a quick scoop. Like I'll just be lucky and a client will have a jump on something and we'll send it to us as well. And with their permission, of course, I then post that on LinkedIn. So I try to kind of spread the knowledge and the wealth that way. So that's the best way.
Awesome. I'll add a link in the show notes. So thank you again for joining us, Joanne, and thank you to everyone for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's conversation, please remember to rate, review, and subscribe to the Free Spirits Podcast, and we'll catch you on the next show. Thank you.
Thank you so much.